friends, my name is Marines, and today I'll be talking about how I rate and review my books. When I first joined BookTube, this was a really popular video to make. Like, you basically made your BookTube newbie tag and then you made a video like this. I made one pretty early on in my channel and it's been up this entire time, but I figured it would be a great time to update that, especially for people who have found my channel more recently, for those who will find it in the future, and coming off of the back of talking a lot about critical reading and reviewing. I think this is a super interesting thing to talk about, just understanding the different ways that people process the books that they read and the things that are important to them in the books that they read. And I think this serves like a really good baseline for people when they consume my reviews. So you can hear kind of how I'm approaching it and adjust to your own parameters accordingly. So you kind of understand how your methods and your measurements stack up against mine. We'll start with star ratings because usually when I finish a book, the first question that I ask myself is, what would you give that in terms of star rating? And once I've thought about it more and I really start kind of exploring my thoughts and feelings, that star rating might be adjusted, but it is a good jumping off point for me. It's a good gut check, and I just kind of start there in terms of like, what am I feeling this is like before diving in further. I know that star ratings can be tricky for some people and they find them pretty limiting, but I personally love star ratings and I enjoy using them. Star ratings function differently than reviews, and I think star ratings do a good job communicating a little bit of information very quickly. You definitely need the review to understand the star rating more and to really get the reasonings behind it, but that's the function of a review. The star rating is there to just kind of give you that first visual representation of what you can expect. I also really like that it helps me organize my reads, whether that is on Goodreads or a personal spreadsheet. You can literally kind of sort your reads and group them up by star ratings, but also in my own head, like it helps me to compare a work to other works that I've given a similar star rating to see how they stack up. And it is one way that I can really refine my thoughts and feelings on a book. I personally use the Goodreads star rating system, at least in terms of what each star rating kind of means. I don't love it, but I made the decision when I started my channel to adopt this method because Goodreads is where I was primarily tracking my reading and organizing my reading. It helps me to be consistent and to maintain my star ratings because I use those parameters and it's what I've been using across the 5 years that I've been here on BookTube. So according to that definition, 1 star is did not like it, 2 stars is it was okay, 3 stars is I liked it, 4 stars is I really liked it, and 5 stars is I loved it. That's still pretty broad, so I'm going to break down for you guys what each star rating means for me. 1 star books for me are books in which there are basically no redeeming qualities. I disliked all the major components of the book, the writing, the plot, and the characters. I did not enjoy reading it, and I would recommend it to basically no one. Some examples of popular books that I rated 1 star include all of the books in the Twilight series by Stephenie Meyer. I cannot imagine giving that particular brand of racism anything but 1 star. City of Bones by Cassandra Clare. 13 Reasons Why by Jay Asher. Everything Everything by Nicola Yoon, A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas, Shatter Me by Tahira Mafi, and Ninth House by Lee Bardugo. 2 star books are books that get a little closer to straddling that line between good things and bad things, but ultimately they tip the scale on the side of bad things. Still, in 2 star rated books, there are one or a couple good things about the book, a character that I really enjoyed, competent writing, at least in terms of syntax and word choice and stringing together intelligible sentences. Or maybe it was a book with an incredible premise or an incredible introduction that ultimately failed to deliver. These are kind of my shoulder shrug books and ones that I still would not recommend. Examples of popular books that I rated 2 stars include Chain of Gold by Cassandra Clare, To All the Boys I've Loved Before by Jenny Han, A Discovery of Witches by Deborah Harkness, All the Crooked Saints by Maggie Stiefvater, The Magicians by Lev Grossman, Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson, and Ready Player One by Ernest Cline. 3 star rated books are now where we get into the territory of half good things and half not so good things. They are books that I might have enjoyed reading in the moment, but that I suspect won't have any staying power in my memory or in my feelings because at the end of the day, it just kind of averages out. The problems here tend to be too little or too much of a good thing, repetitive writing, overuse of a trope, flimsy world building, or one-dimensional supporting characters. Examples of popular books I've rated 3 stars include Turtles All the Way Down by John Green, Truly Devious by Maureen Johnson, Johnson, Sorcery of Thorns by Margaret Rogerson, Shadow and Bone by Leigh Bardugo, and 99% Mine by Sally Thorne. 4-star books now tip the scale in the other direction. So this is a 3-star book with a couple less problems, so that the majority of elements are good with 1 or 2 exceptions. I leave the book having had a mostly positive experience and can reflect back on my reading experience as an enjoyable one. These are books that I would recommend with 1 or 2 caveats. And some of these books in my examples are like personal all-time favorites. They are books that I absolutely love, but that I can still take a step back from and say it did not quite get there on 1 or 2 elements. Books like My Brilliant Friend by Elena Ferrante, Take the Lead by Alexis Daria, The Knife of Never Letting Go by Patrick Ness, Strange the Dreamer by Laini Taylor, Uprooted by Naomi Novik, An Absolutely Remarkable Thing by Hank Green, and The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid. And finally, 5-star books. In as much as a book can be perfect for one person, these are my 5-star rated books. They've engaged my feelings and my attention. They avoid major storytelling and writing pitfalls. It would be very difficult for me to come up with one or more than one negative thing to say about it. And these are books that I would highly recommend. Some of my 5-star rated books are Americana by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, Circe by Madeline Miller, The Poet X by Elizabeth Acevedo, The Shadow of the Wind by Carlos Ruiz Zafón, Black Girl Unlimited by Echo Brown, and Hal's Moving Castle by Diana Wynne Jones. As for reviewing, I do consider my enjoyment of a story, but to me, the technical aspects of the story are important enough that ultimately my enjoyment of the story is wrapped up in its quality. I won't say never, but I don't think you'll hear me say something like, I really enjoyed the story, but the writing was terrible, 5 stars. That's not the way that I rate and review books. A book with terrible writing cannot be 5 stars for me. The plot had a giant plot hole, but I loved all the characters, 5 stars. Again, not a 5-star read to me. A giant plot hole is weighty enough, is big enough that that would dock at least a star. From my perspective, and this isn't to invalidate anybody else's way of doing things, it's really fun to hear about somebody's emotional reaction to a story. And in fact, I have a whole podcast where we talk about things critically, but we lead with that kind of like enjoyment, emotional reaction to it. So I really appreciate that. And I think, like I said, it's really interesting and engaging to hear that, but it's not always as helpful as hearing them comment on the elements of the story itself. Ultimately, both things are subjective. All of this is subjective, but there's so many outside things that can affect your enjoyment of a story that mean nothing to other readers or to the people who are listening to your review. Like whether or not I baseline emotional enjoyed a story can be affected by my mood that day, what I did before I started reading the book I read before I read the story, the current state of the world, and whether or not it's on fire. I think all of that stuff is really interesting, and it's important in terms of the context that we are reading and reviewing in, but ultimately that stuff is less helpful to somebody who came to my review than saying something like, here's how I found the pacing and the characters and the plot and the writing. I try to balance these things in my review, especially because there is no clean way to separate these things out. I can't just say, okay, stay over there, feelings, now I'm going to talk about the writing. Like everything is very interconnected. So I just, like I said, try to keep a balance and keep that in mind when I'm presenting information that I hope ultimately explains how I feel but is useful to you. I want you to know when a book hit the wrong plot beats, even if you also know that I was in a crappy mood. I once heard it described more or less this way, like I know that the pieces of the example are there, but I'm kind of putting it in my own words now. But if books take you on a road trip, there are some readers who get in the car and really kind of zone out and don't really pay attention or worry about what kind of car they just got in, or the driving, or the scenery along the way. They're just waiting to get to the destination. The destination is ultimately what matters most to them. At the end, they can think, wow, that was a pretty easy ride and the destination was worth it. There are other readers that get in the car and they immediately start looking at the landscape and thinking about the route that's going to be used to get there, and paying attention to the bumpiness of the road and how long it takes to get there. And while the destination is definitely part of their trip, the enjoyment of the trip as a whole is a cumulative experience. What I'm saying is that I'm the bench in the car that's looking out the window and telling the driver that they're driving too slow. I want to look at the landscape of the book. The scenery is just as important to me as is the route of getting there. there. And there are some people that the ultimate destination or their ultimate experience of the book is what matters most, without looking too deeply into things like writing and setting and whatnot. All of that just kind of adds up to if I liked it or not without breaking it down further, where to me, part of the enjoyment is that further breakdown of looking at the individual parts. Particularly, I get really stuck on this idea that a book is a collection of words, and I really love words so very much. And words mean things, and it's important to me how a book and a story uses its words. If the writing is bad, if there is a ton of repetition, if you are Stephanie Meyer and you cannot for the life of you figure out how to end a sentence or use a comma, if you fail at description or if you overwrite, all of these things are things that really matter to me as a reader, and it's one of the major components that I consider when I'm reviewing. Other than how important writing is to me, it's hard for me to make generalizations otherwise about how I review books or what kinds of things are important to me, because I read pretty widely. I give pretty much anything a chance unless it's something that will scare me or that will, like, I don't know, invite the devil into my home, like that stuff I don't mess with, but otherwise I will pretty much give anything a chance. And because I gain a lot from the reading experience and not just the destination, I think I'm more willing than most to stick with a book, and I am very willing to give a story or an author multiple chances. I don't have a set of questions that I ask myself to sort of guide my review. I typically start at that enjoyment gut check and work backwards from there. Did I like it? Why or why not? And that why or why not gives me a second tier of things that I can then branch off other questions and kind of explore more deeply. I read a lot of ebooks, so when I'm reading an ebook, I tend to use the highlight feature a lot. If I'm noticing any kind of pattern with the writing or the punctuation or descriptions or anything like that, I'll highlight it in one color. I will highlight quotes that I enjoy in a separate color. If I notice that I'm asking myself a question about the story, I will write that question in a note at the point in which I thought of it, and then that helps me come back later and track kind of where I asked the question and where it was answered, and that's a good way for me to measure kind of the pacing or if anything kind of dropped off or there were holes in the plot or things of that nature. If I'm reading a physical book, I will either tab it, or if I don't have tabs available, I'll literally just grab my phone and take a picture of the page. Another thing that I find really helpful is that once I do that enjoyment gut check and I think, wow, I really love this book, for instance, I will go and read reviews, but I will read reviews for the opposite feelings. So if I think I really love this book, I'll go read 1 and 2 star reviews. I find that if I read 5-star reviews of the book, things that match more closely with how I'm feeling, it's easier to just adopt those people's thoughts as my own and be like, yeah, that. But if I read opposite, it helps me really have to prepare my argument and to decide whether I agree or disagree in a way that is more helpful to me, specifically to develop things in my own words. In my Goodreads reviews, I've been trying to frame things as reasons why you may like a story and reasons why you may not like that story. I try to incorporate some of those elements in my reviews, and you'll typically hear me say, I've read such and such things against it or for it, and I disagree because, just kind of trying to present something that's a little bit more well-rounded in terms of why you may or may not agree with my take on the book. The last thing that I'll say about my rating and reviewing style is that I really value honesty, and that is not to say that everybody else doesn't or others don't, but when I think about what I want to create here and what I want the space to be, I want you guys to know that whether or not you agree with me, whether or not you like me or you enjoy my content, that if you're listening to a review that I've made, that you get the sense that I am just sharing my open and honest feelings about a work with no other agenda. I really value frankness, especially if it is done respectfully and hopefully sometimes with some humor. Like, that is what I am trying to create here. That's how I approach my reviews, and I hope that this video gave you a little bit more insight into how I rate and review books. I know we've been talking about this on my channel across the last few videos, but I would love to keep the conversation going. Do you guys use star ratings? Do you like star ratings? I know there is an anti-star rating contingent in the book community. How do you guys feel about that? If you write reviews, how do you approach them? What is kind of your starting point? Or do you have that set of questions that kind of points you in the right direction? Let's chat down in the comments. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you guys soon. It's great because later I have to come back to the pictures and be like, what in this paragraph was I even trying to capture? I figure it out most of the time, which is why I have not abandoned this like primitive method. But yeah, I have to go through my camera roll after I've done a review and just kind of delete these random pictures of pages.